If I hand you a manual on how to build a bookshelf, like one of those dense, slightly infuriating instruction booklets you get with flat pack furniture, you expect it to be painfully literal,
Oh,
right?
absolutely. You don't read an IKEA manual to, contemplate the metaphysical nature of storage.
Right. It has a single concrete function. Step 1, insert peg A into slot B. Step 2, attach the shelf to the bracket.
Exactly. You physically execute those actions in the real world, and at the end of the afternoon, well, hopefully, you have a physical object holding your books.
Hopefully being the operative word there. But imagine taking that exact same instruction booklet and handing it to a team of, say, highly educated, philosophically minded translators who speak a completely different language.
Okay, I'm following you.
And they don't just translate the words, they translate the vibe.
Right.
Over time, their translation turns that manual into a book of abstract poetry about the concept of holding knowledge.
Hmm.
Suddenly, insert peg A into slot B isn't a physical instruction anymore.
Oh, wow. So it becomes a metaphor for the intersection of human intellect and universal structure or something like that.
Exactly. But you'd never get the actual bookshelf built.
No, the wood would just sit in a pile on your floor.
Yeah.
But interestingly, you might end up launching an entirely new school of philosophy regarding interior design.
Yeah, the text fundamentally survived, but its core utility and meaning were radically re-engineered. And that tension, that massive paradigm-shattering shift from a concrete physical instruction manual to an abstract philosophical framework is the engine behind what we are unpacking today.
It really is the perfect analogy for what happened historically.
Welcome to another deep dive. We are thrilled you are here with us. Today we are pulling apart one of the most consequential linguistic shifts in human history.
If you're someone who wants to understand how massive civilization-shaping ideas evolve, you are absolutely in the right place today.
We are investigating exactly how the theology of the New Testament fundamentally changed from the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh.
We are looking at a transition that completely rewrote the spiritual DNA of the Western world. I mean, how did a localized, strictly observant first-century Jewish sect transform into a Gentile-dominated global religion?
That's the big question.
And the historical and textual evidence reveals that this wasn't just a geographical expansion, from the dust of the Middle East to the marble of Rome. It was a complete rewiring of an entire belief system.
And the primary tool for that rewiring was language, specifically the leap from ancient Hebrew to Koine Greek. Okay, let's unpack this.
It's a huge shift.
It really is.
Oh.
But just to level set with you listening before we dive into the deep end, we aren't here to step on anyone's toes or, litigate personal fame.
No, not at all. We are treating these texts as ancient historical artifacts.
Right, we're putting them under the microscope of linguistics, literature, and history to see what the mechanics of the language actually dictate. No religious agendas, no taking sides politically or spiritually.
Exactly. We just want to look at the undeniable textual differences between the ancient Hebrew manuscripts and the later Greek manuscripts and figure out why these massive shifts happened.
Because to truly understand the New Testament, we have to look at the soil it grew in, right?
Right. The assumption most people make is that the New Testament is just a seamless, direct continuation of the Hebrew Bible, like just part 2 of the exact same story.
It's a sequel.
Yeah, the sequel. But linguistically, there's a massive fracture between the two.
The New Testament was written in Koine Greek, and when its authors referenced the older scriptures, they weren't sitting there meticulously translating from original Hebrew scrolls, were they?
Not at all. For the most part, they relied heavily on the Septuagint.
Let's linger on the Septuagint for a minute, because it's basically the catalyst for everything we were talking about today. Why was this Greek translation floating around in the first place?
Well, it goes back to Alexandria, Egypt, centuries before Jesus. Following the conquest of Alexander the Great, Greek culture and language just blanketed the known world.
Right, Hellenization.
Exactly, Hellenization. It was incredibly pervasive. Over a few generations, you had a massive Jewish diaspora living outside of Judea, particularly in Alexandria, who simply no longer spoke or read Hebrew.
Their native tongue was Greek.
Right, so the Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek, so this huge population could actually read their own heritage.
Which sounds incredibly practical, honestly. It's just an accessibility initiative.
It was. But here is where the problem starts. Hebrew and Greek are not just a one-to-one cipher. They represent fundamentally opposing ways of perceiving reality.
I think this is a point a lot of people miss. Hebrew is an Eastern, concrete, action-oriented language, while Greek is a Western, abstract, philosophical
And
language.
give you a sense of the disparity, ancient Hebrew has a relatively small vocabulary, and it's
Ah,
deeply rooted in the physical senses. Agriculture, the body, the land.
everything you can touch and see.
Exactly. Greek, on the other hand, had spent centuries being honed by philosophers like Plato and Aristotle.
The heavy hitters.
Yeah, it had a massive, nuanced vocabulary designed specifically to categorize the unseen world, to debate abstract concepts, and to define states of being.
Let's ground this in a real example for the listener. Let's look at the concept of repentance. If you are reading the Hebrew Bible, the word used is shav. Break down the mechanics of shav for us.
Shove is purely kinetic. It literally means to return or to turn back.
Like physically.
Yes, physically. Imagine you are walking down a road and you suddenly realize you are heading toward a cliff. Shove means you stop walking. You physically pivot your body 180 degrees and you walk back the way you came.
So in the context of the Hebrew Bible, the path is the Torah, God's instructions.
Right. Repentance isn't about feeling a certain emotion. It is the physical action of changing your behavior to align back with the covenant.
Okay, so if I steal my neighbor's ox, shav isn't me sitting in my tent crying and feeling guilty about it.
No, absolutely not.
Shav is me walking the ox back over to my neighbor and paying him restitution. It's the bookshelf manual. Step 1, you did the wrong thing. Step 2, physically undo it.
But when the New Testament writers approach this concept in Greek, they don't use a word that means physical turning. They use the word metanoi.
And what does that mean?
Well, metano is a compound word. Meta implies change, and noi relates to the mind, to perception. It literally means a change of mind or a shift in thinking.
Wait, so it's entirely an internal cognitive event.
Exactly. It completely relocates the arena of faith.
That is a staggering leap. An ancient Israelite repents by altering their physical trajectory and their actions in the community. But a Greek thinker repents by having an intellectual paradigm shift.
Yeah, the religion moves from the hands and feet into the brain.
Wow. It shifts the entire religious framework from an external communal way of life into an internal isolated state of mind.
It does. But the implications of this translation shift become far more explosive when we look at how the translators handled the actual name of God.
Oh, this is huge. Let's talk about the name of God. In the Hebrew text, God has a highly specific, localized, personal name.
Right. It's the four-letter tetragrammaton, YHVH. It is intimately bound to the specific covenant made with the Israelites at Mount Sinai.
It's not just a generic term for a deity. It is a proper name, like a signature.
Exactly. And out of deep reverence, the Jewish tradition eventually developed a prohibition against speaking that name aloud.
Right. Substituting it in speech with the word Adonai.
Yes, which means my Lord. So when the Jewish scholars in Alexandria translated the Hebrew into the Greek Septuagint, they actually carry that oral tradition into the written text.
I see.
Like everywhere the specific name YHVH appeared, they didn't transliterate it to sound the same. They replaced it entirely with the Greek word Kyrios.
And curious is a remarkably generic term, isn't it? It just means lord or master.
Very generic. You could use Kyrios to address a Roman magistrate. A slave would call their owner Kyrios.
You could even call a human king Kyrios.
Precisely. The linguistic ambiguity introduced here is basically the hinge upon which early Christian theology swings.
Because by swapping a highly exclusive proper name for a generic, flexible title, the text opened a door that previously didn't exist.
Exactly. Because the New Testament writers, who were largely utilizing this Greek text, realized they could take Old Testament passages originally, explicitly about YHVH, the God of Israel, and apply them directly to Jesus.
We really have to look at the specific textual maneuver Paul executes with this. Take Joel 2.32 from the Hebrew Bible.
Great example.
The original text clearly states everyone who calls on the name of YHVH will be saved, meaning physically delivered or rescued from a disaster.
Right. That was the context.
But look at what Paul does in Romans 10.9. Writing in Greek, Paul adapts this completely because his Greek text just says, Lord, Paul writes, if you declare with your mouth Jesus is Lord, using Kyrios, everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved.
Paul leverages the ambiguity of the translation to redefine strict Jewish monotheism.
It's brilliant rhetorically, but a massive shift theologically. The original Hebrew text leaves absolutely zero room to insert a second figure, a Messiah, or an intermediary into that verse. It is exclusively about YHVH.
But the Greek text creates a semantic loophole. By applying the Greek title to Jesus, Paul effectively transfers the divine attributes and the exclusive worship of the God of Israel onto a first-century Galilean rabbi.
I can hear a skeptic listening to this right now thinking, isn't translation just swapping vocabulary? I mean, I translate apple to manzana in Spanish, but I'm still eating the exact same piece of fruit.
Right, are we making a mountain out of a linguistic molehill?
Exactly. What would you say to that?
Well, what's fascinating here is that translating theological and philosophical paradigms across completely different language families is nothing like swapping simple nouns.
It goes back to our instruction manual analogy.
Exactly. When you take a Hebraic worldview, which is intensely rooted in physical space, agricultural cycles, community justice, and visible action, and you force it through the filter of Hellenistic Greek, you are forcing it into a culture obsessed with Platonic ideals.
Because the Greeks were fascinated by the unseen, right? The eternal spiritual realm.
Yes. They actually viewed the physical world as a flawed, temporary shadow of the ideal spiritual world.
So translating YHVH to Kyrios, or shove to metanos, isn't just changing the label on the jar. It is fundamentally altering the contents.
You aren't just giving the apple a new name, you are changing what the apple represents in the universe.
And this isn't just academic trivia, you know. The entire foundation of Western theology, our legal systems, and our ethics was constructed on the bedrock of this specific linguistic collision.
It really was. The way billions of people today conceptualize their relationship with the divine, their moral obligations, and even their own psychology is entirely dependent on choices made by translators working in Alexandria.
And early Christian writers adapting those translations in Rome. Which brings us to the beating heart of today's deep dive.
The moral pillars.
Yes. If everyday words and even the name of God underwent this radical philosophical shift, how on earth did everyday people understand what God expected of them morally? What happened to the foundational pillars of the text? Righteousness and justice.
Well, to understand the magnitude of the shift, we have to establish the Hebrew baseline first. In the Torah, the core word for righteousness is tzedek.
Okay, and we need to strip away a lot of modern religious baggage here because today, for you listening, when people hear the word righteousness, they often imagine a sort of glowing aura of personal piety.
Right, like someone who doesn't curse, who prays a lot, who is morally clean on a personal level.
Exactly, but that is not what tzedakah meant in the ancient Near East, is it?
Not even close.
Yeah.
Tzedakah is essentially an action verb dressed up as a noun. It means active, physical charity, and covenant faithfulness.
So it's about what you do, not just who you are internally.
Yes. It is the explicit moral obligation to care for the vulnerable members of society. Specifically, the quartet of the poor, the widow, the fatherless, and the resident alien or stranger.
And the crucial piece of context here is that tzedakah is not philanthropy as we think of it. It is not something you do to be a nice guy or to get a tax write-off.
No. In the Hebrew mindset, it is a strict, non-negotiable requirement.
Because it is tied to the concept that everything ultimately belongs to God. The wealth or the resources you have are just on loan.
Exactly. Therefore, ensuring that the margins of society are fed and protected isn't an act of extra credit goodness. It is simply doing what is objectively right. It is maintaining the baseline balance of the community.
It is deeply pragmatic. And right next to tzedakah is its twin pillar, the Hebrew word for justice, mishpat.
Mishpat is the active maintenance of that community balance. It entails living in harmony, respecting the dignity of human life, and protecting the property of others.
So it means prohibiting theft, violence, and economic deceit, like using rigged scales in the marketplace, which the prophets were always yelling about.
Right. Economic fairness is huge. And when an injustice inevitably occurs, mishpat demands a restorative process. The wrongdoer must be held proportionally accountable, and the victim must be given fair restitution.
Let's look at a story to make this real. The story of King David and the prophet Nathan in 2 Samuel chapter 12. It perfectly illustrates how deeply interwoven tzedakah and mishpat are and how they operate far beyond just a simple legal code.
It's a brilliant example.
So, to set the stage for you listening, David has committed adultery with Bathsheba. To cover it up, he uses his royal power to have her husband, Uriah, placed on the front lines of a battle and deliberately abandoned to die.
It is a gross abuse of absolute power.
Exactly. So Nathan the prophet confronts David, but look at how he does it. He doesn't walk in with a scroll of the law and read a penal code to the king.
No, he traps David with a parable.
He tells the king a story about a rich man with massive flocks of sheep and a poor man who has one single beloved little ewe lamb that sleeps in his arms like a daughter.
It's a very emotional setup.
Very. And when a traveler visits the rich man refuses to take from his own massive flock and instead steals and slaughters the poor man's only lamb for the feast.
And David's reaction is visceral. He is completely enraged. He demands that the rich man must restore the lamb fourfold and deserves to die because he had no pity.
And then Nathan drops the hammer on him. You are the man.
It's such a powerful moment because David did break specific laws, adultery and murder.
Yeah.
But Nathan's indictment and God's judgment zeroes in on David's failure as a king to uphold mishpat and tzedakah.
Right. David acted like the wealthy man. He hoarded power and ruthlessly exploited the vulnerable. The Torah's vision of justice isn't a cold, blindfolded statue holding scales.
No, it is intensely concerned with equity, compassion, and the protection of the weak from the powerful. God is furious with David, not just for breaking a rule, but for being a fundamentally unjust man who abandoned compassion.
That is the Hebrew framework. Concrete, active, community-focused, intensely concerned with how you treat your neighbor in the physical world. But then the text moves into Greek.
And everything changes.
What happens to tzedakah when it crosses that linguistic border?
In the Greek translation, tzedakah is rendered as dikaiosin.
And what did dikaiosina mean to a Greek speaker walking around Athens or a Roman in Corinth?
Well, in the secular Greco-Roman world, dikaiosina was a philosophical and legal term. It meant legal righteousness, moral excellence, or the state of being as one ought to be.
It was heavily debated by Plato in the Republic, right? As an abstract virtue of the soul.
Yes, it was a status you possessed internally.
So when the New Testament writers begin using dikaiosina to build their theology, the gravitational center of the religion completely shifts.
It has to.
Righteousness is no longer defined by the concrete social action of feeding your poor neighbor. It morphs into an abstract individual status. It becomes about whether you internally are legally right with God.
The communal safety net is replaced by individual legal standing. Under the Hebrew tzedakah, your righteousness is verifiable. Did you leave the corners of your field unharvested for the poor to glean? Yes or no?
It's measurable.
Exactly. But under the Greek dikaiosina, your righteousness becomes an invisible legal declaration granted by God based on your internal faith or belief.
It's the difference between being a good neighbor by physically walking over and mowing their lawn when they have a broken leg versus holding a notarized certificate that legally declares you to possess the status of good neighbor.
Even if you never step foot in their yard.
Exactly. The certificate is all that matters to the Greek mind.
And what's fascinating here is that once you redefine righteousness as an abstract legal status, you inevitably trigger a massive theological chain reaction.
How so?
Because if the definition of righteousness, the ultimate goal, changes, then the definition of failing to achieve it must change as well.
Which forces us to look at the redefinition of sin. If righteousness is a legal standing, then sin becomes a legal debt. And the way the Hebrew text handles sin compared to the Greek text is entirely different.
Worlds bar.
Let's break down the Hebrew spectrum of sin because it is incredibly pragmatic.
Yeah, the Hebrew Bible does not have one flat catch-all word for sin. It operates on a highly nuanced spectrum of intent and severity. The most common word used hundreds of times is chada.
And chada is originally an archery term, right?
Yeah, exactly. It literally means to miss the mark. Imagine an archer aiming at a target. They draw the bow, they try their absolute best, but a gust of wind catches the arrow and it hits the outer ring.
That is chada.
Yes. It is a failure, it falls short of the ideal, but it is unintentional. It is an error born of human frailty, ignorance, or accident. You didn't hate the target, you just missed.
Like a student who studies all night but still gets a math question wrong on the test. They aren't rebelling against the concept of mathematics, they just made an error.
Right. Moving up the spectrum, you have avon. This is more serious. It means to bend or twist something out of shape.
Theologically, what does that look like?
It implies bending God's instructions to suit your own desires. It involves a level of conscious rationalization, knowing what is right, but twisting the context to justify doing something wrong.
Okay, I see. And then at the extreme end of the spectrum, you have pesha.
Yes, pesha. This is outright, deliberate, high-handed rebellion against authority. It is an intentional severing of the covenant.
It is the subject of the realm looking the king in the eye and declaring war.
Exactly. And the crucial thing to understand is that the Torah handles each of these categories distinctly. The legal and sacrificial remedies for an unintentional chada are completely different from the severe consequences of a deliberate pesha.
But the New Testament, writing in Greek, takes this entire nuanced, deeply pragmatic spectrum and aggressively flattens it out.
It really does. The New Testament relies heavily on the Greek word hamartia. Now, while hamartia also originally had origins in missing a mark in secular Greek in New Testament theology, it is weaponized as a broad, encompassing brush.
So it loses all that nuance.
Completely. It treats almost everything wrong, from a minor, unintentional slight to a deliberate act of murder, as evidence of a universal abstract state of being. You aren't just committing individual sins, you are in sin.
And this flattening out lays the concrete foundation for arguably the most famous and pervasive doctrine in all of Western theology, original sin.
Yep. Paul writes in Romans 3:23, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God."
And the New Testament and the church fathers who followed constructed a framework suggesting that humanity is entirely corrupted at a genetic level.
Yeah.
We inherit guilt from Adam.
The doctrine of original sin posits that human nature is fundamentally broken from birth. You are born with a massive negative balance in your spiritual bank account that you cannot possibly pay off through your own actions.
Let me jump in here because if we look back at the original Hebrew text, that concept is completely missing. In fact, the Tanakh seems to explicitly reject the idea of inherited guilt or total depravity.
It absolutely does. The Hebrew prophets were adamant about individual accountability. Ezekiel 18:20 explicitly states, "The soul who sins shall die. The son shall not bear the guilt of the father, nor the father bear the guilt of the son."
So the justice system of the Torah demands that you can only be held accountable for your own actions. We see this beautifully illustrated right at the beginning of the text, in the story of Cain and Abel in Genesis 4. Cain is furious, his face is downcast, and he is on the verge of murdering his brother. But before he does anything, God speaks to him.
And what God says is telling. God doesn't say, "Cain, you're a totally depraved creature bound by the inherited sin of your parents, so you can't help what you're about to do."
Right. God says sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it.
You must rule over it. That single phrase dismantles the entire premise of total depravity. The Hebrew view insists that humans are created in the image of God, fundamentally good, and endowed with the agency and free will to make choices.
Sin is a behavioral obstacle to be mastered, not an inherited genetic disease that has already conquered you before you're even born.
Cheers. Exactly.
To put it in modern terms for you listening, the Hebrew view of sin is like getting a speeding ticket for something you actually did. You made a choice, you pressed the gas pedal too hard, you got caught, and you have to pay the fine. You are individually accountable for your own action.
Right. And the New Testament view.
The New Testament view of original sin is like being born into a family that possesses a massive, multi-billion-dollar debt incurred by an ancestor centuries ago, and the moment you take your first breath, the legal system holds you entirely responsible for that debt. You are bankrupt before you even learn to speak.
That is a brilliant way to frame the discrepancy. And it perfectly sets up the massive theological problem that the early Christian writers had to solve.
Which is?
If you have used Greek philosophy to redefine sin from an individual, manageable action into an inherited, universal, unpayable debt, how do you clear the ledger? If humanity is totally depraved, they cannot possibly save themselves.
You need a massively powerful, entirely unprecedented mechanism to pay off that debt. Which brings us to the mechanics of atonement. Okay, let's unpack this.
To understand the Christian solution to this newly invented problem, we really have to look closely at how atonement actually functioned in the original Torah. Because popular culture has a massive misconception about this.
Oh, totally. People assume the ancient Israelites were just constantly slaughtering animals to pay for every bad thing they did. Like, I lied to my mom, better go kill a pigeon.
Right, the idea that blood equals forgiveness for everything. But the text is highly specific and severely limited regarding what a sacrifice could actually do.
So how did it actually work?
In the Levitical system, blood sacrifices like offering an unblemished female goat or a bull were exclusively permitted for specific unintentional sins, for chada.
Only the unintentional ones.
Only those. If you accidentally became ritually impure or you committed a minor infraction out of ignorance, you brought a sacrifice. The sacrifice was a physical, economic cost that served as a tangible mechanism to restore you to ritual purity and community standing.
So what happens if you commit a deliberate, high-handed sin? What if you commit pesha? What if you murder someone, or commit adultery, or openly blaspheme?
There was absolutely no atonement sacrifice allowed for those crimes. You could not go on a flock of sheep to the temple to pay off a murder charge.
Right.
Those intentional crimes carried severe, often capital penalties. The Torah's justice system demanded direct accountability, restitution, or punishment for the guilty party. There was no loophole to offer an animal as a scapegoat for premeditated violence.
Furthermore, we have to address the nature of the sacrifice itself. The Torah explicitly and repeatedly forbids human sacrifice. In Deuteronomy 12.31, God calls the practice of burning sons and daughters to other gods an abomination that he hates.
And it goes further than just the physical act of sacrifice. The underlying legal principle of vicarious atonement, the idea of punishing an innocent person to pay for the crimes of a guilty person, is a direct violation of divine justice in the Hebrew Bible.
Right. Deuteronomy 24.16 is unequivocal on this. It says, "Parents are not to be put to death for their children, nor children put to death for their parents. Each will die for their own sin."
You cannot execute an innocent man to let a murderer go free. That isn't justice in ancient Israel, and it isn't justice in any modern legal system today. It's a perversion of accountability.
But the New Testament, particularly the book of Hebrews, is forced to present a completely contrasting system to solve the problem of original sin.
Yes. The author of Hebrews argues that the blood of bulls and goats could never truly take away sins, which, as we just discussed, is technically true for intentional sins in the Torah.
Right.
But Hebrews introduces a radical new mechanic. Jesus is presented as the ultimate eternal high priest operating outside the Levitical priesthood in the order of Melchizedek.
And as this ultimate high priest, he doesn't offer an animal. He offers his own human body and blood to take away all sins, both unintentional and intentional, past, present, and future, once and for all.
Hebrews chapters 9 and 10 build this elaborate theological architecture, claiming that this single act of vicarious human sacrifice is the ultimate fulfillment of the law.
But when you hold that claim up against the actual text of the Torah, it is a profound contradiction.
It really is. The Hebrew system demands that the guilty person repent, turn around, shove, and take accountability. An innocent person cannot be put on trial and executed to clear the ledger of the guilty.
So, if you are an early Christian writer trying to convince a Jewish audience that this new system is the truth, how do you do it? You can't just ignore the old scriptures.
No, you'd lose your audience immediately.
You have to somehow prove that your new theology was hidden in the old texts all along.
Exactly. You have to fundamentally reinterpret the Hebrew scriptures. And the New Testament writers did this brilliantly, utilizing a mix of Hellenistic literary styles and first-century Jewish interpretive frameworks. We are talking about methods like midrash, pesher, and metalepsis.
Let's define these for the listener because they are the tools that built the New Testament. How does a technique like pesher actually work?
Well, pesher is a form of interpretive commentary, where the reader assumes that the ancient text is not actually about its original historical context. Instead, they view it as a prophetic puzzle that only applies to the reader's current moment.
So it ignores the original history?
Yes, it is a highly subjective, present-focused reading. It strips away the historical reality of the original author and forces the text to be entirely about the current theological movement.
And metalepsis.
Metalepsis is a rhetorical technique where you allude to an older text, but you give it a new, layered, or updated meaning. It's like a theological remix. You take a familiar melody, but you change the lyrics to suit a new narrative.
Let's see these tools in action with perhaps the most explosive textual debate in ancient history, the virgin birth. The Gospel of Matthew constructs this doctrine heavily on a quote from Isaiah 7.14.
Yes, Matthew 1.23 says, "The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel." Matthew treats this as a direct predictive prophecy about Jesus.
But if we go back to the original Hebrew text of Isaiah 7, the context is deeply embedded in an 8th century BCE geopolitical crisis.
Right, King Ahaz of Judah is terrified of being invaded by an alliance of neighboring kingdoms. The prophet Isaiah comes to Ahaz to give him a sign that the threat will pass quickly.
And what is the sign in the original Hebrew?
The Hebrew text uses the word Alma. It says, "Behold, the Alma is with child and will bear a son." Now, in Hebrew, Alma simply means a young woman of childbearing age.
It implies absolutely nothing about her sexual history or biological virginity.
Nothing at all. It is a completely mundane statement. Isaiah is essentially telling the king, look at that young pregnant woman over there. By the time her kid is old enough to know right from wrong, the kings you are terrified of will be destroyed. It is just a timeline for a specific political event.
But the Septuagint strikes again, right?
Yes, it does. When the Jewish translators in Alexandria converted Isaiah into Greek, they translated Alma into the Greek word Parthenos. And Parthenos explicitly means a biological virgin.
So Matthew, writing in Greek decades after Jesus, utilizes this specific Greek mistranslation as a foundational proof text. But what I find fascinating is why this resonated so deeply with a Greco-Roman audience.
Why do you think it did?
Well, to a strict Hebrew reader, a virgin birth is a bizarre, unnecessary miracle. But to a Roman, divine parentage was the standard proof of greatness.
Oh, absolutely. Look at their mythology. Heroes like Heracles, Perseus, or even historical figures like Alexander the Great or Augustus Caesar were often claimed to have been conceived by the union of a god and a human woman.
So a virgin birth didn't sound strange to a Roman. It sounded like the minimum requirement for a savior. Matthew's use of the Greek translation perfectly bridged the gap, wrapping a Hellenistic mythological concept in the veneer of ancient Hebrew prophecy.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, let's look at another massive example of this reinterpretation. Isaiah 53, the famous suffering servant passage.
Modern readers often view this as a detailed, irrefutable prophecy of the crucifixion.
But again, we must look at the original historical context. The latter half of Isaiah, often called Deutero-Isaiah, was written during the Babylonian exile. The Jewish nation had been conquered, their temple destroyed, and they were forcibly relocated to Babylon.
The ultimate trauma.
Exactly. In these chapters, the servant who suffers is explicitly identified multiple times as the nation of Israel itself, bearing the brunt of geopolitical trauma.
And the good news that the prophet talks about in Isaiah 52 isn't about going to heaven. It was a literal news report.
Yes, the good news was the rise of King Cyrus the Great of Persia. Cyrus defeated Babylon and issued a decree allowing the Jewish exiles to physically return home and rebuild Jerusalem. The suffering servant Israel was being rescued from their physical exile.
But the New Testament writers apply pesher to this text. They completely sever it from the historical reality of Babylon. They take the physical, geographical exile of a nation and transform it into an abstract metaphor for the spiritual alienation of all humanity from God.
And they take the suffering of the entire nation and apply it exclusively to a single individual, Jesus.
It is a masterful piece of rhetorical reframing. It takes a concrete historical event and spiritualizes it for a universal audience. And nobody in the early church was better at this kind of textual maneuvering than the Apostle Paul.
Oh, Paul was on another level.
The sources outline a technique Paul uses called the string of pearls, or charaz in Hebrew. It's essentially theological cut and paste.
Paul was brilliant. He was a highly educated Pharisee, fluent in Hebrew, deeply trained in Greek rhetoric, and he knew exactly how to manipulate a text to build an argument. In Romans 3.18, Paul wants to prove his new doctrine that all of humanity is entirely sinful and corrupted.
So how does he do it?
He creates a composite quote. He stitches together isolated fragments from Psalm 14, Psalm 5, Psalm 140, Psalm 10, Psalm 36, and a verse from Isaiah.
Just pulling pieces from everywhere. To a Greek reader in Rome receiving this letter, it reads like one seamless, devastating poem from the ancient scriptures, proving human depravity.
Right. But he literally pulled a sentence from here, a half sentence from there, completely out of their original context, to build a brand new theological framework.
And Paul is so deeply committed to his new theology that if the text didn't say exactly what he needed it to say, he would actively alter it. He wasn't just passively relying on the Septuagint. He would correct it when it didn't fit.
Let's look at 1 Corinthians 15.54. This is a perfect example of a hybrid translation.
Right. Paul is discussing the resurrection and the defeat of death. He quotes Isaiah 25.8. Now, the original Hebrew text says, "He will swallow up death forever," meaning God. It's a message of ultimate victory.
But the translators of the Greek Septuagint had botched this verse terribly. Their Greek translation read something along the lines of, "Death has swallowed them up when it prevailed."
Which is the exact opposite meaning. The Greek made death the victor.
Exactly. Paul, knowing both the original Hebrew and the flawed Greek, rejects the Septuagint's version because it destroys his argument. But instead of just translating the Hebrew accurately, he crafts his own sharp, triumphant Greek phrase, "Death has been swallowed up in victory."
He actively fuses his knowledge of both languages to create a polished rhetorical weapon for his Gentile audience. He is not just reading scripture, he is actively engineering it.
He really is.
Okay, so we have seen how they rewired the language, shifted righteousness from action to status, invented the concept of an inherited universal debt of sin, revolutionized the mechanics of atonement, and completely re-engineered the ancient prophecies.
It's a massive overhaul.
But this Hellenistic rewiring didn't just change how people lived and believed in the present, it completely changed where they believed they were going after they died. Which brings us to the afterlife in Greek mythology.
The transition regarding the afterlife is perhaps the most visible evidence of Greek cultural assimilation. The original Hebrew concept of the afterlife is incredibly austere. It is called Sheol.
And Sheol is not a fiery torture chamber, and it isn't a kingdom of clouds and harps, is it?
No, Sheol is essentially the grave. It is a dark, silent, shadowy pit. And the critical detail is that everyone goes there equally. Kings, peasants, the righteous, the wicked, they all descend into the silence of Sheol.
There is no active consciousness, no interaction, no reward, and no punishment.
Right. The entire focus of the Hebrew Bible is intensely terrestrial. Obedience to God matters for this life, for the health of the community, and the ultimate hope was for a physical, earthly kingdom of peace and justice.
But when you read the New Testament, you suddenly encounter concepts that sound like they were lifted directly out of a Greek epic poem.
Because they basically were. The New Testament introduces an entirely new cosmology regarding the afterlife. It introduces Hades, the Greek underworld, complete with compartments for reward and active conscious torment.
And it mentions Tartarus, right?
Yes, Tartarus, the abyssal pit where Greek titans were imprisoned. The expectation shifts from a physical earthly kingdom to an abstract, spiritualized kingdom in the heavens.
The sources make a blunt observation here. The New Testament writers are actively using Greek words inextricably associated with pagan deities. Words like Oranos for the heavens, Thanos for death, and Hades for the underworld.
Think about the historical paradox of this. Jesus of Nazareth was a devout, fully observant Jewish rabbi. The Torah he followed, specifically Exodus 23:13, explicitly forbids the Israelites from even speaking the names of other gods.
So a Hebrew-speaking Jesus would never use those words.
The historical probability that a Torah-observant Hebrew or Aramaic-speaking Jesus was walking around the shores of Galilee, casually incorporating the names of Greek gods like Hades or Tartarus into his theology, is virtually zero. These concepts and terms were retroactively applied to his teachings through the Greek translation process and the cultural assimilation of the later Gentile church.
And as that Gentile church grew and assimilated more deeply into Greco-Roman culture, it actively and aggressively distanced itself from its Jewish roots. The sources point to early church fathers like Ignatius of Antioch in the early 2nd century. What was his argument?
Ignatius, and many who followed him, utilized this new Hellenistic foundation to establish replacement theology, also known as supersessionism.
And what does that mean?
They argued that because the Jewish leadership rejected Jesus as the Messiah, God had permanently canceled his covenant with the nation of Israel. The Gentile church had entirely replaced Israel as God's chosen people.
And a core component of that argument was the total abolition of the Torah. They argued that the law, all the concrete commandments about tzedakah, mishpat, the dietary laws, the Sabbath, were just a temporary inferior tutor, a shadow that was no longer necessary now that the spiritual truth had arrived.
Which is a complete fundamental contradiction of the Hebrew text itself. Psalm 119, the longest chapter in the Bible, is an exhaustive, passionate love letter to the eternal nature of the Torah.
Right.
The psalmist calls the law a delight, a permanent guide in eternal truth. But by filtering the entire religion through Greek philosophy, which elevates the abstract and spiritual over the physical and concrete, the Church Fathers possessed the philosophical justification to discard the physical laws of the Torah entirely.
I want to pause here for a second and just ask you, the listener, to reflect on this. When you hear words like sin, righteousness, heaven, or hell, you probably assume you are connecting with the ancient faith of Abraham, Moses, or David.
Most people do.
But what the textual evidence shows is that you are actually hearing those concepts through the ears of a first-century Greek philosopher. Your spiritual vocabulary was shaped more by the translation academies of Alexandria and the rhetorical techniques of Greco-Roman writers than by the Bronze Age prophets of the Levant.
It is a profound realization. When a text is violently transplanted from one cultural and linguistic soil into a completely opposing one, the fruit it eventually bears is unrecognizable from the original seed.
So let's pull back and look at the massive journey we've been on today. We started by examining the linguistic rewiring, how swapping the highly specific covenantal name YHVH for the generic Greek title Kyrios created a semantic loophole that allowed the merging of God and Jesus in the text.
We saw how the foundational moral pillars shifted. The concrete, action-based communal charity of Hebrew tzedakah morphed into the abstract individual legal status of Greek dikaiosune.
We explored how the nuanced, deeply pragmatic spectrum of Hebrew sin, the difference between an unintentional missing of the mark and a deliberate rebellion, was flattened into a universal state of depravity. This paved the way for the doctrine of original sin and inherited unpayable debt.
And how that newly invented debt necessitated a radical new mechanism of atonement, a vicarious human sacrifice that directly contradicted the Torah's explicit laws regarding justice individual accountability, and the strictly limited nature of blood sacrifices.
We analyze the brilliant, though highly controversial literary tactics of Paul and the Gospel writers, how they utilize Pesher and metalepsis to creatively reinterpret prophecies, turning a young pregnant woman in an 8th century political crisis into a Greek-style virgin birth.
And transforming the literal Babylonian exile into a universal metaphor for spiritual salvation.
And finally, we saw how the silent, earthly reality of the Hebrew grave, Sheol, was entirely replaced by the vivid, conscious, mythologically infused realms of Greek Hades and Tartarus.
Understanding these historical, linguistic, and textual shifts is absolutely vital for anyone seeking to be genuinely well-informed about the evolution of world religions, literature, and the history of human ideas.
Because knowledge is most valuable when we understand the why and the how behind the texts that shape the world we live in today. We have to be willing to look under the hood at the mechanics of translation to truly understand the evolution of belief.
It is about recognizing the layers of history, the political pressures, and the linguistic compromises that make up the documents sitting on our bookshelves today.
So I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. We began today by talking about translating a literal instruction manual for a bookshelf into a book of abstract poetry.
Right.
We have just spent the last hour dissecting how an entire global theology, the way billions of people understand justice, guilt, and eternity, was profoundly, irrevocably altered by the translation of a handful of words. The shift from young woman to virgin, or from missing the mark to universal inherited guilt.
The staggering, almost terrifying power of a translator's pen.
Exactly. So here's the question I want you to carry with you. If the foundation of the world's largest religion, and by extension the moral framework of Western civilization, was so dramatically shifted by the philosophical preferences and linguistic quirks of ancient Greek translators, what other foundational truths in our modern world, in our legal system, our historical narratives, our political structures, might simply be the result of a very old, very persuasive mistranslation?
It is a question that demands we look closer at everything we accept as absolute.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the manuals, keep looking past the translations to the original texts, and keep exploring. We'll catch you next time.